Welcome to The Leading Voice, brought to you by Vector and Voice.
Welcome to the Leading Voice Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Al Wilson, and this is the podcast where we inspire excellence in mathematics education, one conversation at a time. We would like today to tackle the phrase that makes a lot of math teachers sweat and even more students shut down, and that is assessment. Specifically, we want to look at how a single grade can feel like a courtroom verdict. So, if we think about it, a student finishes a test on Friday, they get their grade of a C, and what does that student say? Well, you know what? I passed. The grade itself isn't a tool for growth, it's more of a sentence, a courtroom sentence. And so it tells the student exactly where they are in their mathematical journey, and it wraps it up in a nice, neat little bow of compliance and tells the class, you know what, you've gotten the grade that you deserve, and so now it's time to move on. The magnitude of the assessment is completely wasted because it lacks direction. The assessment is pretty much just a static dot on a map instead of a vector driving learning forward to help those students reach their learning targets. And so, what I'd like to do today is to break down how educational leaders can coach their teams to shift from treating assessment like a final sentence and treating it more of a continuous conversation. And so, let's look at how a traditional assessment model works. Uh, you teach the material, you assign the homework, you give a quiz or some other formative assessment, you record the grade, and then you close your grade book. The data pretty much goes into your grade book to essentially die. And so when we talk about formative assessment, we want people to assume that it means more than just giving the quiz. If you are measuring um, more often than you are changing what you do, it's not really doing a formative assessment. You're essentially just stepping on a scale every day without changing your workout. And so, if you want the truth in terms of how we can effectively look at this feedback loop, it requires three distinct phases. The first phase is, where am I going? What are my learning targets? The second phase is, where am I right now? What assessment tools am I using in order to determine student performance? And then the third is, how do I close that achievement gap? What are the actionable steps in order to help bridge the learning gap for a lot of these students? The third step is where the system usually breaks down. And so, leaders, if you listen to what your teachers are doing after the data comes in, if the teacher looks at the diagnostic and looks at the data and says, you know what, 40% of my students failed, but I have to stay on par with this pacing guide, it's time to move on to the next unit. Uh, was that assessment a sentence? Was it a court verdict where the students are kind of like left to hang? And so, what we want to do is we want to give our leaders some high leverage moves that they can look at for when they are doing their classroom walk-ins, walkthroughs, excuse me, and we can begin to have conversations surrounding assessment and look at how feedback can be changed in order to help our students. So the first thing we want to do is we want to replace the grades with questions, um and not just having the students get just that letter grade. If a student sees a grade of a C or a 70 or what have you, um, research shows that the student just completely stops reading the teacher's comments. And so when you're giving those formative assessments and you give that letter grade, that grade triggers an emotional response, and that student just shuts down cognitively. Professor and researcher Dylan William, who has studied feedback and grades for decades, recommends in his book Embedded Formative Assessment that using narrative feedback in lieu of grades is a more promising way for students to grow and to really achieve that growth mindset. If you give a grade and a comment, the student looks at the grade. If you only give comments, the student gains a significantly higher level of confidence and achievement. And so you want to coach your teachers to highlight a specific line of math and write. What I mean by that is look at your visual model here. Does it match with the um does it match with the learning targets, those state standards, and those learning objectives? In our assessment, how are we determining that those students are reaching or approaching those standards of learning through the proficiency based learning models? Or uh, does your prompt just keep the conversation going when you're addressing the needs of these students? When you're reviewing your lesson plans, look at the end of the week. Is there built in any day or sort of like a buffer for responsive teaching, where you can kind of give the students more feedback, allow them to walk through that gradual release of responsibility in their learning? Leaders need to give teachers explicit permission to slow down and not have to power through each unit of instruction. If the teacher feels the pressure of rigid linear pacing, they will always treat an assessment like a sentence, or a court sentence, because they simply don't have time to hold the conversations with their students. And so let's address the elephant in the room for administrators. Um, it If we force teachers into input percentages, weighted categories, and calculating grade means and averages, um, it completely misrepresents what the student growth actually looks like. Um, and so if a student gets 20% of their first try and 50% of their second try and 100% of their final try and achieve that mastery. But when you look at the grade book, that student only achieves a grade of 56%. Um, it tells the student that their past failures are not permanent. Those aren't anchors that are holding them down in their proficiency, that they have the ability to learn and to grow through the multiple attempts that they have within that unit of instruction. And so we want to change our policy around evidence, allow teachers to use the most recent, most consistent, most evidential component of learning rather than just the strict averages. Allow for standards based tracking to encourage teachers to use their grade books to override that final calculation to reflect on how the student landed toward those learning targets, even if they struggled through it. And so to wrap this up, if your classroom teachers are not spending time having that discourse, if they are spending all their hours just grading papers, and then at the end of the day or the end of the semester, the end of the school year, just having those papers wind up in the recycling bin, um, what what assessment systems have you built? Because those aren't the things that the students are going to take with them as they progress through the matriculation of high school, college, middle school, and so on and so forth. However, if your classrooms are built on loud discussion, having discourse, allowing the students to debate within mathematical models, looking at rubrics and self assessments, then you can begin to develop that feedback loop. You have a direction, you have your vector. And so um, during your collaborative planning, during your PLCs, your walkthroughs, look at how you are providing feedback to your students. Um, it is more of a dialogue between student and teacher and not just a monologue between teacher and gradebook. And so, thank you for listening to the Leading Voice podcast. For more frameworks, coaching tools, and instructional strategies to drive proficiency forward, please visit us at vectorvoice.com.